Okay, gang. Hello again. Um, so it's a Tuesday, and I was hoping to get this video done yesterday, but as I mentioned in an email, I had all kinds of internet madness yesterday. My wife's business is run out of the house, and they use some huge files that they work on in the cloud together, and so that eats up a lot of the bandwidth. And then, of course, this pandemic business is hitting everyone. I think all the internet connections are a little spotty. Um, but I did manage to get things going again in the casita out here. It seems like it's working pretty well so far. So I'm going to do this video on Descartes, and then I'm going to follow up with another one on Vico and Spencer, and then that'll be the videos for this week. And we are marching through the decades and the centuries in these weeks, trying to get up to the 20th century, which is where things become more substantial and interesting and for rhetoric, not just sort of around rhetoric. So we're dealing with kind of broad themes here in the early modern period. This is 16th, 17th century that we're thinking about right now. Last video on Renaissance rhetoric in the Renaissance, we talked about humanism. We talked about sort of the social landscape where rhetorics mattered, but more as a kind of cultural study, right? It's like the study of how to express oneself and how to kind of wield influence in terms of language and manners and performance and style and all that. So this business, I'll just repeat it again. It's the important theme moving through this week, last week, next week is this Renaissance, early modern, late modern period. The big theme is the decline of rhetoric in the Aristotelian and Isocratean modes or models, right? Those models are not in play throughout this period, except in smaller examples. One could make an argument, I think, for Erasmus being an Isocratean, although his interest in style and expression puts him pretty hard in the Gorgianic camp. Vico also is someone who we could probably think about as Isocratean. These are more rare cases. So just to kind of throw it out, be kind of upfront about it. In the period from the 15th to the early 20th century, the model that predominates in terms of what rhetoric is and how it operates and how it's thought of is frankly Gorgianic, right? So what's going on here, and we see this is the kind of the transition into Descartes, is the quest for certainty becomes quite pronounced throughout this period, and it takes different forms. It takes increasingly less of a kind of religious, metaphysical kind of form, right? So the church starts to kind of wane in terms of its social dominance. But then you have the rise of industry, science, logic becomes super important. And this new thing of science, right? And so we're not going to look at Francis Bacon, but Francis Bacon's quite important in this time period, as known as the sort of the father of the scientific method, right? And so science had been talked about long before this, but this idea of a kind of a methodological approach to studying the external world, Francis Bacon is important there. So here for the first time we have a kind of rigorous empirical mindset about mapping, testing, hypothesizing, data, right? And physical hard data, and using theories and exploring and explaining and testing and counter-testing and all that. That whole enterprise kicks off around this time. So we're looking at Descartes primarily because of this, this move towards certainty, whether through science or through logic. Logic is sort of like, think Plato without the metaphysics, right? Plato is a very logical kind of deductive syllogistic thinker, right? And so it's all about operating from kind of certain premises down to sort of conditional conclusions based on inputs and outputs and so on. All right, so the predominant kind of knowledge pursuits of this time period, this broad time period, were science, logic, technological kind of innovations, and all of this stuff is relying on really, certainly understood knowledge. Descartes is, in some ways, not, the most relevant person to be talking about in terms of these developments, but kind of overarching sense, he's probably the best single figure to kind of be the face of this centuries-long drive for certainty. All right, so when we know that we are dealing with someone who's fascinated by certainty and is trying to achieve certainty, that's our first clue that we're in the realm of the Platonic model, right? And to the extent that we're in a Platonic world, we are not in a world very friendly toward rhetoric. So rhetoric was not an important discipline, social practice for quite a while in terms of how it is that humans were engaging with one another and trying to persuade and generate ideas through each other. All right, so we are very far away from Aristotle and his ideas about enthymemes and doxa and topoi, thinking about audiences and finding a kind of knowledge that maps between speakers and audiences. All of that stuff is kind of gone for a while. In its place is this quest for certainty over here, and then what Herrick calls a managerial rhetoric. This rhetoric during this early modern period is known as managerial in the sense that it doesn't come up with ideas, it manages ideas. Rhetoric is merely kind of transmission. It's merely the way in which we convey ideas that are generated somewhere else, that are generated through processes of logical deduction, that are generated through empirical studies of situations, right? So we get our truths somewhere else. We get our proofs, our ideas somewhere else. And then rhetoric comes along and manages those truths using style and delivery. Okay, so expression, eloquence, style, delivery, these things matter, but they're not primary. In terms of rhetoric's function as a substantial human endeavor, okay? So Descartes is someone who we can look to as kind of setting the tone for, how it is that intellectuals and leaders and, policy types and intellectual figures and so on were thinking about knowledge and truth on the one hand, and then engagement with others on the other hand, right? All right, so we can do this pretty quickly. It's not a terribly difficult reading, frankly. This is from his Meditations. This comes out of a philosophy textbook I studied out of as an undergraduate. It was like a reader, kind of, and it has like selections and excerpts from some of these major philosophical treatises and works going, all the way back. And so it's a pretty good little text here. And so there's some pages from Descartes' Meditations. So Descartes was a French mathematician. He's someone who was, obsessed with math and geometry and these kind of abstract, perfect areas of inquiry. And as you can see here, his whole goal in this enterprise, I remember reading this as an undergrad and being kind of tripped out by it, because he's essentially like live blogging his own attempt to come up with certainty, right? So here's a guy who's like philosopher who's sitting in a cottage in front of a fireplace, and he's like writing his kind of live thoughts about this enterprise of how do I come up with certain knowledge? It's actually the express point of this whole piece here is, how can I come up with knowledge that I can be certain of? What can I be certain of? And how do I know for certain, right? And this whole endeavor is very kind of modernist in its aspiration for like absolute logical certainty, right? And so it's quite fascinating because he's kind of doing this in a sort of ongoing live sense and kind of sharing his thoughts as he's having them. I don't know to what extent this was like composed and thought through in advance, or to what extent he actually was doing what he's doing on the page here, which is like reflecting, and now I'm having this thought, and now I'm having this thought, and I'm realizing this, and I'm realizing that. But it's a kind of a journey that he's going on over the course of a couple of days, where he's just thinking, Like how, with his own thoughts, just him and himself, quietly, privately. This is sort of the privatization of knowledge right here, right? We don't have a dialogue that we got like with Cicero's De Oratore, right? Where you have 6, 7 people sitting around a table and all kind of sharing and taking turns. This is solitary, it's private. And he's literally trying to come up with basically perfect knowledge, right? How do I know for certain? What can I know for certain, okay? And so I'll let you read through it on your own. It's pretty easy, and we don't need to get bogged down in the particulars. But what he's basically doing is he's saying, what can I know? What can I trust? What can I rely on? And he starts with like the external world, right? And he starts with his own senses. And sure enough, like if you've ever, I got a drink here, I got a Starbucks beverage. And like, you know how you sometimes will see a straw or a spoon going into a cup of liquid and then all of a sudden it bends? You can literally see the straw bending. So it's like something's wrong here, right? My senses are perceiving something that looks completely false. Can I trust what I'm actually seeing, Or like you've probably been in a car with your girlfriend, boyfriend, mom, dad, whatever. Someone is like hot and you're cold, or you're hot and they're cold, or whatever, and it's like you can't agree. It's like, what's the temperature? I don't know. Is it hot? Is it cold? I don't know. I feel something different from you, right? So this is kind of Descartes' point here, is like we can't really trust our senses. Senses will deceive us. Senses will go wrong, right? How do I know how far that distance is? Maybe my eyes are starting to go bad, right? Maybe you're seeing something a lot clearer than I'm seeing it. So fallible. Senses are fallible. And so I can't trust my senses. I can't trust my own ability to kind of perceive the world, right? And so, again, if he cannot trust with 100% certainty what it is that he's perceiving or thinking, then he's got to, like, get rid of it, essentially. He's trying to come up with certainty. So he goes through and he's talking about, he gets to the point here, I'll just jump to it. It's pretty wild. He says in the bottom of 138, right, it's like, if there's error in terms of how we're perceiving the external world, then what are we to make of that? And he says, I shall then suppose, last paragraph on 138, not that God, who is supremely good and the fountain of truth, but some evil genius, not less powerful than deceitful, has employed his whole energies in deceiving me. I shall consider that the heavens, the earth's colors, figures, sound, and all the other external things are not but the illusions and dreams of which the genius has availed himself in order to lay traps for my credulity. All right, so if I can't be 100% certain that my senses are reliable, then I have to assume something like there's some kind of evil genius that's tricking me. Some of you might have heard of Elon Musk. The Tesla guy says some crazy things on social media sometimes, and he didn't invent this, but he mentioned this on one of his posts and one of his tweets a while back. This whole kind of theory about, like, what if we are living in, like, our lives right now are just a simulation in a video game that people way in the future have created, and we don't realize. It's sort of like Westworld, It's like we are the robots living in Westworld. What if we are in some kind of, AI simulation? Who knows? We're some, subjects in an experiment. It's sort of along those lines of like the evil or genius deceiver, right? It's like we can't be sure of anything out there, outside of our bodies, and even that comes through our bodies. Our taste changes. There's some kind of a berry out there. As you know, I'm fairly into cooking and chef culture and restaurants, and there's a berry that you can take out there that if you eat it, it radically changes how you taste things. And so stuff that's like really sweet will taste salty and all this weird kind of stuff. All right, so Descartes would be like, okay, we can't trust any of that, right? So discount it, get rid of it. Now, this is a problem for rhetoric, of course, because rhetoric is all about appealing to the senses. It's about appealing to the appearances. Basically, it's all about kind of what's on the surface of our experience together. Like we can talk about the stuff that's out there that we all kind of encounter, not perfectly, not completely, but it's like these are the reference points that we're drawing on to make sense of the world together, right? And if we cannot point to that stuff and say, hey, do you see that? Or don't you know this? Or whatever, we are losing this whole kind of realm of doxa and rhetoric that was so important for the ancients. So you can already see how Descartes' thoughts on certainty are hostile to rhetoric, right? So, but he continues, right? So I can't be certain of my senses. I can't be certain of the external world. Well, what about me, myself? What about, inside my body? So then he gets into the soul and he gets into his own mind. Now, if you know anything about Descartes, popularly, then you kind of know where this is going. So on 142, he's just asking all these questions. Like, how do I know? How do I know? So he says in that little paragraph on 142 toward the top, he says, but what am I? What am I? A thing which thinks, right? So I'm a body that senses, but I can't trust that. So, like, what else? I'm a thing, an embodied thing that thinks. Aha. What is a thing that thinks? It is a thing with doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, and so on, right? So he continues along this line for a while, and arrives at this position that, he became famous for, which is, even if my thoughts are being deceived or I'm being tricked within my thoughts, that kind of baseline notion that I am at least thinking. I can know of nothing else for certain except that I am thinking these thoughts. Now, the thoughts might themselves be, expressions of something else, but I know at least this much. I am thinking, right? So that leads to sort of his key moment here, 144, the top paragraph. He says, it is my mind alone which perceives. He says, but what must particularly be observed is that that its perception is neither an act of vision, nor of touch, nor of imagination, but only an intuition of the mind, which may be imperfect and confused, or clear and distinct, as is and is composed. And he says a few more lines down, I am almost deceived by the terms ordinary language. Sorry, this is not what I was looking for. I guess 145 at the very end there, he says, there's nothing I can see more clearly than my own mind, right? And so this gives rise to his statement, I think, therefore I am, which, does he say that explicitly in here? Actually, back on 141, right in the middle there. Yeah, about 8 lines up from that middle paragraph. What of thinking? I find here that although it is an attribute, that thought is an attribute that belongs to me, it alone can be separated from me. I am, I exist, that is certain. But how often? Just when I think, for it might possibly be the case if I ceased entirely to think that I should likewise cease altogether. It's like the Matrix. If you die, if your brain thinks you're dead, you can't live without your brain, and so you die in real life, right? To speak accurately, I am not more than a thing which thinks. I am not more than a thing which thinks. That is to say, a mind or a soul or an understanding or a reason. I am, however, a real thing and really exist. But what thing? I have answered. A thing which thinks, right? So that is like his final kind of place, the position that he arrives at, which is everything else I can distrust, but I can at least be certain of the fact that I am thinking and I am a thing that thinks, right? And so out from that flows certainty. And so the Cartesian approach then is to kind of start with that kind of one nugget of certainty that you've arrived at, you've established, for truth, for certain, and then to sort of build outward from that. Now, what's the next thing that I can be certain of? And then the next thing that I can be certain of, right? So it's this radical act of kind of, get rid of everything and then kind of rebuild based on those principles of certainty and verifiability and logical, rigor and all the rest of it, right? So that's kind of it. And he arrives at that moment of, I think, therefore I am, right? So he's privileging the act of cognition over everything, over human sociality, over religious experience, over artistic experience, right? So what it means to sort of exist is to have cognition. That's putting a huge amount of priority on rational, reasonable processes, right? And today we know that, like, reason is something that humans are very capable of. It's in that prefrontal cortex part of the brain. That's where our slow deliberative processes are. But huge amounts of who we are as individuals, as human beings, is not rational at all. It's about sensation, it's about moral feeling and intuition and group behavior and so on, right? And attachment and investment and identification, right? So he's in effect quite wrong. We can say that today. But back then, this notion that like our reasoning powers are the very thing that make us unique and special as humans, that is what held sway over this, 200, 300, 400 year period. Reason above all, certainty above all. And so again, to that extent, the Platonic kind of approach to thought, to knowledge, to communication is the one that dominated. And then off to the side, we have an interest in rhetoric as style, as that management of these hard truths, these hard-won, rigorously, established truths about how the world works and how it should be, and right and wrong, and effective and ineffective, and so on. So again, you can see how in this formulation, rhetoric is nowhere to be found, right? Because rhetoric is about, artistic appeals and dealing with audiences and working together and sort of making guesses and working with probabilities, right? In that Aristotelian and Socratean senses, that's very much what we're doing. And so, sorry, I just got a text there. So the reason that I like to talk about Descartes is because you can see quite clearly just how, I don't want to say hostile, but how inadmissible, I guess, rhetoric is in this kind of formulation of knowledge and truth. And what flows out of this is, here is the truth. Doesn't matter how I present the truth is the truth, right? But some people would admit that, yeah, well, we still need to kind of add a little special sauce to the truth just to make it palatable. Kind of like if you've got to give your pet some medicine, you wrap it in cheese or peanut butter. Rhetoric is the cheese or the peanut butter. It's like the truth, the medicine is derived somewhere else, and then we clothe it with frosting or whatever, and then we manage the delivery of that truth to the audience. That's about it. So let's see here. Yeah. So that's sort of the other big story about rhetoric during this period. So last video we talked about Renaissance humanism, but we also talked about the privatization of knowledge, and rhetoric is something that's now being sort of exercised by sort of individuals, and we're very attentive to how it is that we are receiving messages, and we're very sort of suspicious of sources of message that aren't certain and authoritative and so on. All right, so there's a whole weird thing going on with rhetoric here. And we can see through Descartes just how chilly of a reception rhetoric was receiving at this time. The Western world of Europe in this period took shape more according to the priorities of Descartes, and then Ramus, if you looked at those pages in Herrick as well. Both of them were like logical, they were very orthodox about logic and deductive reasoning. Think the syllogism. Think about these certain premises that you're deducing from, and everything's nice and clean and tidy. It never actually is in real life, of course, but the aspiration and the hope is that we can come up with our nice, clean, tidy conclusions based off of nice, perfect premises that we come up with through science and logic and reason and so on, right? So those are the priorities at this time. Rhetoric is deprioritized, it's de-emphasized. It's just about managing truth stylistically. All right, so that's an important theme throughout this whole period. The next video, we're going to look at a couple of sort of extensions of that same theme. Vico is someone who we can sort of pit against Descartes, but Vico is sort of in the minority. He's interesting because he's about the imagination. And then Herbert Spencer is quite fascinating as well in his thoughts on style for an industrial age. So I'll get those going next, and I hope this is helpful. And just as a reminder that new assignment will be up soon, and grading's happening as well. Not that the internet's good. So hang in there, gang.